It's often said that today, everybody is a photographer. And while it's certainly true that people take more pictures today than ever, I don't agree that this makes everyone a photographer. Everyone is also typing more, be it on their phone or tablet or computer, but that doesn't mean they're a writer, even with autocorrect enabled. Pressing a button may create a picture, but it's what happens afterwards that defines the work and the person that created it. While social media has its role, it's still prints, exhibitions, and books that allow the photographer to clearly define why their work is worthy of attention. Though photographer Gus Powell is known for his street photography, it's been his books that have established him as a unique voice in today's photographic world. He is willing to experiment and even challenge what a book of photography should and can be, resulting in titles that do more than just showcase his work.
You can't just take your 35 super strong pictures and turn them into something. In some ways, it's overpowering. A symphony that's full of tubas is exhausting. But when a tuba lands, when the kettle drum gets hit, the cymbal clashed, that's an exciting moment. So thinking about things in a musical sense, thinking about things that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and what if the most important part of this book is the connective tissue, the thing that joins the pictures together.
We'll talk to Gus about how studying comparative religions in college informed his photography and how he came to embrace the genre of street photography. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Yeah, I'm glad to finally get you on the show. To start off with, when I was doing my research about you, I was really curious about one thing, is that when you were in college, you studied comparative religions. And it's like, okay, how did you come to study that? Because you're known largely as being a photographer. So I was like, okay, how did you come to be interested in that?
When I went to college, I had an arts background, and I went to Oberlin College, which is a very creative place. And I had every expectation of being a studio art major. I started taking those classes and being in that space. And then it was that first semester, and I think everyone has this experience. It's sometimes it's not necessarily what you're studying, but who you're studying with. Mm. And I took this one small colloquium class, is what they called it there, which was kind of like a seminar class. It was 12 students, and it was about mystical poetry, Sufi poetry, and it was with an amazing professor named James Morris, who I still have a relationship with. And across this class, we were reading these poems by Hafez and Rumi and all these people. And this teacher was also at the same time showing us popular culture films, Fisher King, the Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, Groundhog Day, and then he started talking about these poems and putting them into a context of their present moment when they were actually created, and that these poets were kind of like the musicians and the filmmakers of their time. And this class just kind of blew my mind, also because it did the high-low thing so beautifully. We're reading these things that are kind of precious texts in some cultures, but then we're looking at, a movie with, Groundhog Day, which is about reincarnation for sure, and trying to get it right and trying to get closer to the beloved, and trying to, if you think of each day as an opportunity to do the best you can, what do you do with that day? And then if you think of this as that film itself as a spiritual text in some way, something that you leave from that changes the way you live your life. And for me, just what was happening in that class and the amount of creativity that was being brought from the students and that was being asked of the students, it was inherently a more creative space than going into an art class, especially at that time, which was such a postmodern moment. You know what I mean? You could appropriate and rejigger and then support what you were making in that visual space with a kind of postmodern veneer, and you were in the game, but you weren't necessarily giving anything from yourself. And I think that's what I wanted to do. So to be in a religion class but it felt like an art class because it felt like, for me, the path of the artist is trying to express something from deep within you, trying to relate to the space that surrounds you and to other human beings, and trying to move all of that forward. And that was happening in these religion classes, but it wasn't really happening in the art classes. So I kept, again, not knowing, I just kept returning to these religion classes, and with it's like I didn't want to be a priest. I was raised Roman Catholic and all this stuff, but it wasn't a part of my path. But I think the path of, there was a very specific thing. A lot of religions sort of, the way you sort of break them down is you think of ground, path, and goal, right? Ground is what's the nature of the space we're in. What's the goal? Is it enlightenment for one, for all, for everyone? And then what's the path? How do we get from where we are to there? So just thinking of that as practical information to deal with everyday life, and then combining that with an artistic practice, was something that resonated with me. And the clarity of that work and that use of creative thinking and drawing from personal experience and from lived experience, the way that was unfolding in these religion classes was way more powerful than anything that was happening in the art classes. So I just kept taking those classes. And then you get to that point, beginning of junior year, you got to name a major here. And it's like, well, I've taken a lot of these religion classes and these teachers are amazing. So I guess I got to pick that. So I ended up being a comparative religion major, studio art minor. I kept doing the studio art classes, but a lot of them were actually, I started doing a lot of private readings. So I do a photo and writing class that I would create with a poetry teacher. And then it would be still called an art class and give me credit in that department. So I kept having that practice, but, and then by the end of it, supposedly, my father cracked up and says, like, what's this? You're a comparative religion major with a concentration in comparative mysticism. And it's like, all right, but it really has served me. I feel like it served me well. And for me, it was my version of being an art major.
It makes complete sense, because I think that by studying the way that you did, you just it's kind of analogous to any approach to mysticism. You realize there are a myriad of different ways to get to that goal, right? While in traditional art study, it's about singular methods, trying to sort of get into each student. Okay, here's the basic methodology that you have to practice. This is the only way you can get there. You can create variations thereof, but it seems like, okay, there's only a fixed singular path for you to walk. And you basically learned that isn't necessarily true, that you don't have to particularly approach art in that way.
Absolutely. And again, and it really was that first teacher doing this highlight, because this was a super revered, professor internationally in terms of Sufi, tradition, and, incredibly respected translator. But the fact that he was so high-low about it too. I mean, literally giving us these texts, with very specific translations, but then having us look at Groundhog Day and having us look at a Vendor's film, and us talking about the specific lyrics of even a Nick Cave song in the film, and giving that, credibility. That's this is an artist in that time trying to sort of express something, and then he would then fold it back. He said, you got to understand, we revere these poets for, because they're now on a pedestal, but the reality is they were the Kurt Cobains of their moment. These were pop songs that were happening, and they were made in opposition to people who were sort of studying these big heavy texts. And it's like, well, what if I just sing you a line that says, in the time of our Lord, there are fragrant breezes. Watch out and be prepared to receive them. Like, I heard that, and it was like, that's kind of photography. We walk around looking for the fragrant breeze to see if we can smell a little bit of paradise and see if we can catch it, so that we remember what that's like, and so that we can transmit that to others and say, there's something bigger than what's right in front of us, but there's a little piece of it right here,
Your dad was a filmmaker and your mom was a fashion designer. Both very creative outlets. Do you think that this time in college really kind of freed you and made you more comfortable in terms of finding your own means of being creative?
I think to a degree, yes. I mean, the reality is I come from, I'm this 6'5" white guy from Midtown Manhattan, with parents who had creative lives and all of this, privilege and then an only child on top of that, so in terms of the levels that I was supported, encouraged to express myself creatively. That was always there. So when I got to college, I think what happened is it became this moment of knowing that, this is the space I work in. I come from people who are makers and who are creatives. But I think like every kid, you try to find your own toolbox to hopefully deploy that stuff, and in many ways in some ways, I feel like I'm slowly migrating towards a film practice in some ways. But I think it was a very conscious decision to turn towards the still image away from film as a way to sort of carve out an own space for myself, as opposed to sort of continuing something that my father was doing. But then, like what's happening recently is I'm doing lots of fashion work too, with photography. And so now I'm kind of going back to a lot of that education that came from my mother as well, and in terms of looking at fashion and thinking about that. So, in some ways, I don't know that college, I think for some people, college is this moment where you really get to sort of be who you are and you get to really deploy your own set of decisions and actions. I was very much encouraged to do that right from the beginning. So college, I think in many ways, just the fact that I had the idea or the impulse and then the willingness and encouragement to embrace studying religion rather than political science or medicine or all these other things, I think that it gave me that space. And then Oberlin specifically, the thing that was the biggest influence at that school is because it's this music conservatory. It's the oldest music conservatory in the country. And I'm not a musical person, but I had many friends who are musicians. So to be around people who have that type of focus and passion, who discovered the French horn when they were 6 and it's French horn do or die for their whole life, and to see their dedication to work. And that was something that really stuck with me at Oberlin, I think, and at college, was seeing that type of dedication.
Well, what spurred you to want to use the camera as opposed to, say, writing or poetry?
As a kid who was always, I was given a lot of independence, so I would go out on the street and I'd walk around. And early on, I got obsessed with picking up stuff. I was obsessed with finding, like a glove, a workman's glove that had gotten run over by a car 37 times, and is now stuck in a specific gesture, a hubcap that got crushed that now looked like a flattened hat. And I used to collect all these things. That was what I did. I was into, and I'd bring these things home. And at a certain point, there was, my parents were pretty encouraging about this practice, but at a certain time it was just like, you can't keep bringing all this stuff home. And I think, because there were cameras around and my father was very well, here, take this, S670 Polaroid and go out. And I think it was the realization that you could use the camera to collect things, that you could go out and have an experience. And it was another way of bringing things back from outside space to share with others without picking up a bunch of trash. So, I think so many of us, when you start taking pictures, I always think of those kind of photo one things where you take a picture of your sink, take a picture of your cat, you take a picture of, a trash can, and then maybe you start to work towards people and humanity. So I think that same practice was what unfolded for me, going out into the world and first taking pictures of the types of things that I might want to pick up and bring home, but then using it to discover more.
Yeah, the first body of work that I was familiar with was the stuff that you did during your lunch breaks.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you would only have like 15 or 20 minutes to go out and make photographs. And I think that's a really interesting way of cutting your teeth in terms of becoming a photographer, just because you're limited by time, and having such a tight restriction really demands that you go beyond the mechanics of the camera to learning how you actually see. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that time for you in terms of what you were creating, because I know you weren't aware that there was a genre of street photography. So you were kind of coming in from a place where you didn't have the baggage of that legacy. But tell me in terms of what it felt like and what you were thinking of as you were going out making these images during this period.
Yeah, so it was, the camera became an extension of myself pretty early in terms of something that I would always have with me, and I was making pictures, and I've never been someone who had sort of specific shot list or projects that I was working on. It was really, really about sort of having a bipedal life where you put one foot in front of the other, and then you have these moments that stand out to you, things that you would point a finger at that you wanted to validate in some way. So beginning to use the camera to do that. But then when I sort of got this, I had a proper job in the city, as like my friends say in London, and I was working at the New Yorker magazine, and I was making pictures on the way to work, and then on my lunch hour, and then after work. And it was this compression of time and space that you described that both allowed and forced me to make different kinds of pictures, because some days I could slide out for 15 minutes. Other days I could be sneaky and find a way to go out for 90 minutes on my lunch hour. But if you go out for 15 minutes and you're I wasn't looking to describe lunch in New York. I was looking to feel something in that 15-minute moment. So how willing are you? How open can you be to make something out of nothing, to make the most of whatever happens in that 15 minutes, So you might see a couple kiss and there's something in that. But then other days you might just see a group of people waiting for the light to change. So how can you make something with that? And this kind of the constraints, those lines in the sand of like, well, this is it. You've got to feel something and you have to make a picture out of something that's available here right now. It forced me to see more in less, and then what happened is it was actually a friend from college sent me this book of Frank O'Hara's lunch poems, which were poems that he, probably not all, but in theory, he wrote mostly on his lunch hours while working in Midtown at the Museum of Modern Art. And then supposedly he would go to the Olivetti typewriter showroom on Fifth Avenue and he would bang out a poem and then go back to work. And his poems too, he's a real New York modernist kind of poet. They do shine a light on life that's happening on the streets of New York at that time, but they're really about him feeling something. And for me, this little book, and the book itself, it's like Howl. It's one of those City Lights books. It's the size of a passport. And I ate it up, but I kept it with me. I kept it in my pocket because it was the kind of thing that you could. And it was, for me, that little book was this sort of passport. It was like, oh, this is enough. There's enough happening on Fifth Avenue and 44th Street for 6 minutes that I can make work in this time and space that could become something, and it really was this sort of license and passport to keep trying to make those pictures. And then it was in turn then getting to meet Joel Meyerowitz and sharing some of that work with him and his encouragement, who's encouraged so many either directly or indirectly through his work and his voice. But this is important, to go out, to see things, to feel things. This relationship to humanity, this expression of yourself, both validating and questioning the life that's around you, all of that's important. And in some ways that this kind of maybe arcs back to thinking about a spiritual practice of ground, path, and goal. Well, what can I do on this lunch hour to not only fill my belly, but to fill my heart and to get winds in my sails to sort of keep believing in humanity and the shared experience that's all around us.
And you speak to the great challenge, I think, of any photographer, but anyone who spends their time in public making photographs. Yeah. Because the obvious initial experience is simply documenting what's in front of you. But then it's like, well, how do you take these elements that are in front of you that are seemingly chaotic, that have no relationship to each other, and you bring them together in the frame, not just to make something that is aesthetically pleasing, but that expresses something, that communicates something. Yeah. And I think that's the hard part. So what was helpful to you to make that sort of that initial leap? And do you remember a seminal image that you felt, not so much that it was completely successful, but that indicated to you that you were moving in the right direction?
Well, there's a couple of things. I feel like I'm lucky to have had a visual education that began very early, from being a privileged New Yorker and a child of artists that, so many, I used to know all the pictures that were the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in the order that they were on the wall in the old MoMA. And I saw so many of those images as prints, firsthand, and then I was introduced to lots of books. So I had that education. But for me, and it continues to be true, having a relationship with non-visual practices that try to make these same endeavors, that's why I bring up that Frank O'Hara book, to see, oh, this is somebody else who was just trying to make a living, but also going out into the world and looking at it and then also diving into themselves and then putting it on paper and then sharing that. So that practice, right? Because, everybody, there's more photographers than ever, but we all take notes. We all have journals in some capacity, but what's the audience? What are you trying to transmit? Thinking about transmission and communication. And I think especially with photography, the next thing that comes up is editing, right? And sequencing. Right. So the act of simply making a photograph is an act of editing the world. Those four corners, that's what a camera is more than anything else. It's four corners that you put around something. And do I include that guy or not? This person, I think about that image of, from Vietnam, it's right before the guy was shot, that picture where you see all of that. But imagine you saw that picture and you didn't see the gun. It'd be a very different picture. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's a very obvious, but like what you include and what you don't include, how you use those four corners in time and space, how you edit the life around you, and then I think of, all of us who photograph on the street, have hit a parade, right? But there's a moment when you realize like, oh, the interesting part of the parade isn't the parade. It's everybody looking at the parade. It's turning it the other direction. There's that great Ouija picture. It's my favorite Ouija picture called Their First Murder. And there's that, it's a crowd. And there's this one girl leaping up with this grin to look over the older kids. Do you know what I mean? But again, it's not showing the body. It's showing this response to these things. So I think thinking about that sometimes seeing the inciting incident is not nearly as telling as seeing the response to something. Mm-hmm. And at the very least, you have your own response to everything that's happening around you. Even if it's not significant, as a photographer, you are using the camera to, in some ways, have a response to the life that's around you. So, I think in terms of things that sort of put wind in my sails, I think it's just sensing that I wasn't alone, that there is this bigger tradition of people trying to make sense of the world around them. And that often the biggest realizations come in very unsurprising places. It's not, this is not a significant moment, the Bressonian decisive moment. How do you decide, that picture, it's a guy walking across the thing. If you had to sort of script that and say, this is going to make for a picture that people will never forget, you never could, you never would, So I think it's this learning to trust oneself, that if you're true and you have these intentions that are strong and that you really are trying to feel things, you have to be yourself. You have to be present in the space. And that's going to enable you to make something. Yeah. It's, the Pulitzer Prize winning pictures, those are layups. It's the fireman catching the baby. Anybody, that's just about time and space. That's not about heart. That's not about giving something. That's not to discredit those types of pictures, but they're so linked to an inciting incident. And I think that the greatest pictures, I know you recently, we're drilling down into the Winogrand, line about, the picture needs to be more interesting than the thing that's there. And I think that's the case, that the great pictures are undescribable, and you never would have known that that's what somebody's going to make from that moment.
Yeah. One of the things that I really have appreciated about your work, and that is a big takeaway for me, is that editing can be as much of a creative practice as the actual making of the photographs. And it's been really interesting to see your body of work and all its variations in the various books that you've created, how the relationships of the photographs and as they are laid out in, say, a book, really become more than a way of showcasing individual photographs. That it becomes not just about just showing your best work or even necessarily about narrative, but that, that an individual image sometimes it isn't necessary for a singular image to have to hold the weight of the entire experience, the feeling, the themes, and the concepts. They can actually bring together images that normally might not have any relationship to each other, but within the context of some sort of compilation, mm-hmm. It does. And I really have enjoyed how you sort of experiment. The one that you recently came out with, the Manila folder, I thought was just like, oh, wow, he's really turning things on their ear. But tell me about this learning process, about discovering that this was a method that you felt you needed to use in order to really fulfill yourself as a photographer and as an artist.
I think the there's been kind of a real clarity for me recently that I think the books I make are the truest expressions of my artistic practice. I love making, a singular, strong picture on the street, and I've been grateful to get to do exhibitions as well. But it's really in the books that I've made. The first book, The Company of Strangers, was my version of Frank O'Hara's lunch poems, and it's and I tried to express some of the things that we already talked about expressing something about it's not about New York, it's not about lunch, it's just about trying to feel something out in time and space and seeing these little relationships. And that one, I didn't have a practice. I wasn't sophisticated enough yet to sort of figure out how to make it be more than that, but it's a book I'm proud of. But then what sort of happened after that with The Lonely Ones and Family Car Trouble and Brooklyn Brief is this understanding that you can't just take your 35 super strong pictures and turn them into something. It's in some ways it's overpowering. You can't, a symphony that's full of tubas is exhausting. Right? But when a tuba lands, when the kettle drum gets hit, the cymbal clashed, that's an exciting moment. So thinking about things in a musical sense, thinking about things that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and what if the most important part of this book is the connective tissue, the thing that joins the pictures together. Mm-hmm. So, with The Lonely Ones, which was this interplay of text and image, for me, that book kind of lives on the folded edge between the scene photograph and the piece of text, and then trying to do something that can only happen in a book, to have this physical experience of having to read and then turn the page and look at the picture, and maybe it operates like a children's book and gives you a little hit of dopamine, that's this pleasure, and then you go back to the text and then you turn again, but to not let text and image perform in a didactic way, so that there's this kind of pregnant space that goes around the whole book, and then this idea of sequence of pictures. It's an introduction. It educates your audience. The way that you begin that first, the cover, the title, the materials, that first picture is going to be a Rosetta Stone of some kind that will inform your audience how they're supposed to interact with the material that will follow. And then hopefully you disrupt that at some moment. And then you come in with a tuba and a cymbal at another time. And then you have space. So to sort of embrace what can happen in a book, which is a journey, and also I've been very interested in making smaller books too, with the Lonely Ones work, it was medium format, color photography, it was very much these types of pictures in this kind of vein that could have called for a large format kind of coffee table book, but I knew I didn't want to do that. I wanted to sort of disrupt that material in some capacity. Yeah. And when I made the book, it was such a rewarding response, which, afterwards it seemed obvious, but, people said, I read your book last night. And the book has text in it. So there's that part. But, they said, I read it in bed and it's on my nightstand. And it's, it's a small little thing and that's part of it. But the way that people relate to a book that they can hold in one hand and turn the page of is different than the way they relate to a coffee table book. Their expectations, their psychophysical experience of that material. So with each book I've done since then, I've tried to embrace the book as a physical object and how that immediately sets the stage for the experience of the reader, and then how to use that to my advantage, and then also in some cases how to disrupt that. So even with The Lonely Ones, having this, some people, I have a whole commercial practice too. I had a meeting at an ad agency the other day, and I put the books out. It always happens. Somebody picks up The Lonely Ones and they just flip through it and they only see text and they're confused, and then they just drop it down. And I said, well, no, you got to actually, I said this, I don't know if you have time for it, but it's like, you got to open every one. And then they slow down. They immediately slow down. And then they maybe even sit down and they're like, oh, this requires that, and then with Family Car Trouble too, is, very much wanting to figure out a way to use all this family work many of those pictures are not even necessarily particularly strong single standing pictures, but as a collective experience, this sort of trifecta of family, car, trouble, and then pivoting on language. There's the family car, and then there's car trouble, and then there's family trouble, to set the stage with that, and then to have the book be in the format of a novel with a dust jacket, with blurbs, and all of that, so that's the way that someone who picks it up, I know how to read a novel. So, but this isn't a novel. But then they still apply that type of thinking. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. They use those skills. And then again, most recently with Brooklyn Brief, which was just, Roman numerals has been they're a really fun publisher, and they're doing interesting stuff. And we wanted to collaborate on something. And I had registered that I'd been making all these pictures in downtown Brooklyn over the years, where you always see people carrying a folder, an envelope, because that's where the courts are, and that's where the Department of Buildings is. And people come out of the subway, and they always are, you see them holding, it almost seems medieval if you think about the way we're so linked. They're holding this proof of something that they need to use to either get something or defend, So wanting to do something with those pictures where you just, we all have our different things that we take. Anytime I see somebody carrying flowers on the street, I take a picture, because there's a story there. They're saying, I love you. They're saying, I'm sorry. They're saying, get well. There's the object implies a narrative. And the same way, seeing these people in downtown Brooklyn carrying these folders, it's a very different narrative. And often you see the worry in faces, and then you see the schlumpy lawyers. So wanting to sort of combine that material and think about that object, and then have the book itself mimic that, so let's make the book be a manila folder, and let's put it in an envelope. So it kind of folds back in on itself as the object that's actually being observed in public space. So in each case, it's, I really do, I want the books to be objects that take advantage of existing types of reading, existing types of communication, and then to use that to my advantage, and then hopefully also to subvert it in some way. And also to try and not just make, a monograph of 36 amazing singular images can be great, but it's also, it doesn't necessarily, it's not symphonic, it's not necessarily narrative. It's loud.
Every couple of weeks, I get an email showing interest in advertising on the show. Without reading the entire email, though, it's pretty easy to determine that they've never listened to an episode. It's like they found us using a Google search and sent out an email. Even when it's photo related, they are more concerned with the size of the audience than anything about what makes what we do different and special. So many other podcast and YouTube channels focus on gear because that kind of content gets the big numbers. When new equipment is released, they're all in a race to get the episodes up first because those numbers impact their bottom line. It doesn't matter that they're all sharing the same information. Now, I'm not dissing any of those people because that's how monetization works, and that's how the game is played. I just don't want to chase that dragon. I'd rather make a show that I want to make. Just like when I started, I want to create a show that I would want to listen to. And you are helping me to do that with your support. And if you haven't done so yet, you can do that today by becoming a Patreon supporter and contributing a monthly donation of $5 or more a month. A couple of hundred people are helping me to produce a show that is listened to by thousands all over the world. And if you like the way we've been doing things, we could really do with your support. Sign up today by visiting patreon.com/The Candid Frame. Thanks. I get so many books coming through here. It's like you said, each demands a different experience. I have some books that are really oversized. And it's like the only way I can really experience them properly is I have to, set it up. I have to get out my desk. Not even my desk. I have to go to my kitchen table, to be able to go through it. Then there are much smaller books that I can sit in my chair and experience. And it's really kind of fascinating how I have to sort of prepare myself for how I'm going to experience this work. It's really kind of really fascinating to see how the book and its design really informs the ultimate experience.
And it's also, what's your comfort level too? Like if you're sitting in your cozy chair looking at something as opposed to standing at the kitchen island, your psychophysical space is in a different place. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, the fact that people could look at something like a small book that you could actually decide to carry it with you and look at it on the subway later on, as opposed to the Tombstone, the big ones, and that's not, there's some big books that I think really work, but a lot of the times it doesn't necessarily need to be that scale. But that's that thing too. I mean, there was a photographer who, when I was working on the first book and deciding whether or not to make it happen, and he said, well, he's like, I've done a bunch of shows, but I've hardly ever heard anything back. Every book that I've done, they go out into the world. And people they find them, and they find the people that they're meant for. And that's this experience that I think is really special. It's wonderful to do shows, and I think all of us have had great moments in gallery spaces and museum spaces. But that's a different act of pilgrimage, as opposed to, finding a book that feels as if it was made for you and being able to experience it at the moment in time when you're ready for it, as opposed to walking through the threshold of an institution, having that experience and leaving. They both have their values. But I think something that is, the books that are amazing, I think, there's just nothing like becoming friends with a book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm going to go and photograph the old public library that I used to go to as a kid, where I got my first library card, because I really never photographed it. So I'm going to go by there soon. And I don't think it's even a public library anymore, but I still want to photograph the building.
Did you have a spot there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had a section. I wish it was still a library, because I published like half a dozen books. And that was the library that, as a kid, I would go down the aisle and imagine where my book would be in the stacks.
100%. Yeah.
Because I was like, even as a kid, I wanted to have a book published, and I was thinking, okay, here's where my name would be.
That's where you're going to live. That's your real estate. Yeah, these two are going to have to move over a little for you to get in. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So one of the things you just talked about are the shows, and so much of your work, as you said, is dedicated for books. They have an experience with a book. So what's the challenge in terms of translating that when the work is going to be exhibited on a wall?
It's hard. I mean, I'm doing a couple shows of Family Car Trouble that are coming up. We're going to do one in San Francisco in April, and then another one in Milan in November. And it actually becomes that moment of transition. I'm right in it right now in terms of thinking about it. And it's challenging for me, and there's a couple sides of it too, because in some ways, all this stuff takes energy and resources. I mean, I'm sure as well, the amount of money and work it takes to produce a book, the amount of money and work it takes to produce a show. In some cases, the return on the book space seems way clearer to me. The exhibition moment, it's the math on it is more complicated. But what is interesting about it, and I was just speaking with, getting some feedback from a wonderful photographer named Elizabeth Bick, who she's a great street photographer. She wouldn't use that term, but she's a great student of movement in public space. And what she brought up, in terms of thinking about the exhibition space, is you have to think about where the pictures are on the wall and how people move in the space. And for me, that was like, I got the little tingle, it's like, oh yeah, it's like creating a living street scene. And that all of a sudden, that charge of thinking about the experience of people moving and how they can migrate from one space to the other. In the books, I try to control that because, everyone picks up a book and they flip it from back to front initially anyways. And then they decide to commit like, oh, this one this is a story. I need to start at the beginning and go through it. But in a gallery space, they walk it, there's an entrance and an exit, and then there's the bathroom. And then if it's the opening, there's the bar. And that dictates what that initial movement is. And then it might be crowded or uncrowded. So thinking about the physical experience of a potential viewer, I think, is interesting. And then also trying to, again, I'm in the thick of this right now with Family Car Trouble, thinking about what were the objectives what were the desires that I wanted to have manifest in the book. And now think about those again, and how can I make those manifest in an exhibition space, as opposed to just, okay, we can translate the book. This is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Put them in a line. Mm-hmm. Take the greatest hits, make some bigger than others, and you're kind of done. But how can I actually take the original intentions and then use the opportunities that can only happen the same way I try to use things that can only happen in a book? How can I try and make things that can only happen in a gallery space happen and use those? So being able to play with scale is interesting. Being able, with Family Car Trouble, so much of it is sort of a stereo opportunity. There's page left, page right, and these moments happen. Whereas in a gallery space, you can have a whole group of pictures up on a wall that can be performing in some capacity. And you can just triptychs is the thing I'm thinking about a lot with Family Car Trouble in terms of a gallery space, because the whole book itself is, in essence, about these three competing elements. But there's only 2 pages on a spread. And I use those very consciously in a specific way. But what about, working with triptychs in a specific way? So again, it's this thing of trying to go back to what the heart of the intention was in the book, then forget about how you deployed it within the book, but then think about how you can take advantage of a physical space. And then I love this thing that, Elizabeth Vick was talking about it's, think about how people are going to move through it.
That's a lovely gift of wisdom, because I think a lot of people get tied into how things are done traditionally. And sometimes that just doesn't work for the work. I remember,
and also we've all seen it too. I mean, it's, we've all been like, here's the row of prints, with the big frames and the mats and the whole thing. And it's just.
Yeah, because that's designed and it has a particular intent in mind that has nothing to do with the expression of the work. That's basically putting up commodities up on a wall in the hopes of selling them, not for necessarily creating an experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's tricky though too, because it is costly to do these shows, and so as an artist, if you're lucky enough to sell a bunch, great. But if you're lucky enough just to sell a few that cover the cost of the whole thing, that's also great. But getting stuck with a bunch of framed prints has its own, pleasures and joys. But
what's interesting about your work is because even though you're sometimes called a street photographer, your work is really beyond that. Your Family Car Trouble is a very personal exploration. It's more documentary, if anything else. But you do commercial work. So in terms of how, these people come to you and because they want you to use your sensibility for the purposes of being able to market something that's important to them. Tell me how that sort of such a personal way of seeing and shooting translates when the people who want to use you, have a clear goal in mind. It's not just about producing some aesthetically nice photographs. It's really being used as a device in order to sell and market something. So how does that translate? Well,
part of my whole spiel, even when I do my portfolios and things, sort of trying to present myself for commercial and editorial work, is that, the DNA of who I am is a street photographer. And, that's this term that I'm sure has been discussed endlessly on the Candid Frame and in many other places. It's actually a pretty limp phrase. It doesn't actually mean something very specific, and it has different meanings to different people, But this idea of stepping out into the world and believing that something's going to happen. And even if it doesn't happen, I'm going to make something out of what's out here, whatever it is, whether it's a plastic flag blowing in the wind, people kissing, somebody falling, a white elephant marching, whatever it is. So this idea of being able, willing, and desiring to make something out of nothing that will be inscribed with feeling and hopefully credibility of some kind as well is what I try to bring to a situation. Then when that gets introduced into a practice where you're delivering that, the rules are still the same, but what happens is, when we normally go out the door, you have a mathematic equation, X plus Y minus Z to the third power will equal a good photograph. And when you usually walk out, most of those variables are not fixed. It's all open. Sunlight fills one of them, or another day rain does, your own temperament, drops into another, all of these things. But when you're doing a job, a couple of those variables are now fixed. And in some ways, that's actually a great asset because, okay, now I don't have to look for somebody interesting. That's the person who is going to be interesting. But where will they be interesting, and what should they be wearing, and what's the overall mood? So what happens is you start to sort of have, normally you go out and you're trying to control 27 things. And it's actually, I love working because now I don't have to control as many things. A couple of things are already determined for me. And now I still have to make the most and make an interesting picture out of it. Mm-hmm. But there's some lines in the sand that can be useful, and the biggest part of it, though, that follows from this is the editing, right? Especially work that I do that sort of is that has a connection to fashion. I make pictures in those moments where I am sort of aping acceptable, passable, perfectly fine fashion photography, and the model's doing their thing where they look like a model and they know the left side of their face, and this is the look that's their go-to look. Yeah. And we make those pictures, and those pictures, they look good. They're perfectly serviceable. But the other picture, when they looked away for a second because they heard a sound, or they scratched an itch, or something happened that was real, and that even the picture might be a little looser, you look at it. You see somebody standing looking at a piece of art, and I've done a bunch of pictures in institutions. The way they're standing, you can sense that they're really looking and that they're thinking about, they're in dialogue or in relationship to the people around them. So it's not just a matter of just drop them there. The moments have to still be real, and it's that's where the editing comes in. So trying to really control and be strong about the pictures that you think are still inscribed with that snap, that something that made you excited. That's the moment, as opposed to if you look at the picture and you think it could have been made 10 seconds later or 10 seconds before, it probably doesn't have that vitality and that credibility. And I hate tripod. Everything has to keep moving. So many times on jobs, there'll be, often when you get an assignment, there's a deck. Here's the 15 pictures that we need to make. And this one needs to be that. She needs to be looking this way and this, and it's the bag that's important here, so on and so forth. And you deliver those. But what happens is sometimes, okay, we got that. Let's just walk across the street and go over to here. And then while they're walking across the street, you make another picture that nobody asked for. And then that's the one that everybody, this wonderful project I did for Nordstrom's that was such a joy to do. There were multiple moments like that where we invested half an hour doing a picture that was the picture we wanted to make. And then I just had them walk over to another spot to do a version of it. And in that moment of passing of these three girls crossing the street, that picture was the one that everybody responded to. And it's that attention of a street photographer who always believes there's another good one to be had. Do you know what I mean? Don't put the camera down because on assignments all the time, you just go, that's it, we're done. And then that's when I get really excited. Yeah. Because usually people just pause, and then and then boom, 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 boom. And then again, and I have so many times where that's happened.
Yeah, because when I looked at that Nordstrom collection on your website, I really got the feel of that. Because at first I was like, wait a second, is this posed? This is not posed? It was just like, and then I saw that they were the same models. I was like, but it doesn't feel like that. And I thought it was great. Yeah.
It's the lived experience, right? It's like, listen, we're just out here on a good day in New York, and you're gorgeous, and you don't need to do a thing. I mean, you look great and the clothes are great. Let's just see how we can, a big part of my prompts on the street, I'll see something that's the inciting incident, the thing that I'm attracted to. It could be a single person. It could be somebody lying down on steps. And this is very much something that I feel came from working with Joel. So you see that first thing that you respond to, but just forget about it. Push it to the side of the frame. Keep it in the picture.
Yeah.
But now look for something else. Open your heart to the next thing and see if you can get just as excited about that as that first thing, but keeping the other thing still in there. So it's the juggling, right? Okay, that's pay dirt. You stick that girl, that guy, that thing anywhere in the frame, it will be discovered by your viewer the same way you discovered it walking down, 3rd Avenue and 14th Street. But now look for something else. So always having that background in play,
That's the question I always ask myself when I have that experience. Is like, what else is there? Before that, how can you add? Give me what's next, right? Because it's there. I got that, but what? Now what? How can I put that in a context, right? The same way it was in a context when you discovered it, to try and be just as generous and to have it be in a context in your actual photograph. And that goes back to the very thing we were talking about before, about going from simply documenting something to be able to use those things to sort of express it. It's understanding that there are other elements that exist within the scene, and then it's like, okay, here you have these different pieces. How do you want to put them together? And it's unlike a jigsaw puzzle in which everything has its proper place. This is completely subjective. And it's like whatever you want to put together and whatever relationship you want to bring, that's you being expressive. That's you having a point of view. That's you having a voice.
Yep.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend a photographer, and it could be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would the photographer be and why?
Well, I mentioned Elizabeth Bick earlier. I think that she's a wonderful photographer, and she's also somebody that kind of straddles this sort of street photography world with other types of practices. Mm-hmm. And I think, she did this great kind of 3-volume book with Roman numerals that's quite interesting. She's somebody who I'm paying a lot of attention to and I enjoy looking at. And then there's some younger folks too. Brian Carlson, who's at Voyeur1 is his Instagram handle. He's another person who I call him one of the strongest sidewalk surrealists out there. His practice, it very much transforms. It makes you believe that there's a place that looks like the paintings of Magritte, where it's night in one moment and day in another part. And then the other one would be, who's in that same vein, is Haralabos Kriodakis, who's Dirty Harry is his handle. He's also a member of UP as well. And he's another one of these kind of people where he largely photographs in Crete, also did a book on New York, but it's so different than my own practice. It's a total trip. He and I will go for a walk, and what he comes back with, you'd think we were in different continents because the visual language is so different. But the poetic truth and the ambitions of all three of these artists, I feel a great kindred spirit with. And I think that's something I think is really strong, is finding people that you respond to who don't make work that looks like you want to make, but that communicates what you want to communicate.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, man. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise, it's a pleasure to be here. And, I'm so glad that we could do this. And I hope we get to be in the same state at some point soon.
Thanks to Gus for joining us. Find out more about him and his work by visiting guspowell.com. And if you purchase any of his books, please use our Amazon links in the show notes, which provide you yet another way to support the show. I'll be in Washington, D.C. for the Focus on the Story Festival in May, a Memento photographic workshop in El Paso, Texas in August, and my week-long workshop in Tokyo, Japan in December. You'll find details on all of these on our website. And if you're a devoted listener and subscribe to the show, write us a review on whatever service you listen to podcasts. Those reviews lead people to take a chance on the show and allow us to grow. Along with my recent book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow, I just released my latest ebook, 9 Pictures, 9 Stories, Volume 2. The first one got a great response, and I'm back with the follow-up, where I discuss the stories behind 9 images that I created last year. It's only $8, and your purchase is another way to support the show. Purchase that or any of my previously published ebooks by visiting the website. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and our mailing list. On the YouTube channel, I offer critiques on images submitted by TCF listeners like you, while the mailing list keeps you updated with all TCF events, including workshops and more. Sign up today. And remember, you can support the show by contributing to our Patreon effort or donating through PayPal. Thanks to Debbie Arluck, Cesar Zuniga, and Glenn DeCrocco for their recent contributions. It means so much. And if you found that you can't find every episode of the show, download the Candid Frame app, which is available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibadian X, and this is The Candid Frame.